Forbidden history, what Jesus only taught in private. The year is 30 AD. A small group of men and women huddle around flickering oil lamps in a stone chamber beneath Jerusalem. The crowds who gathered earlier to hear parables about seeds and shepherds have long since returned to their homes. But these 12 souls remain, their faces etched with anticipation and something else. Fear. What they're about to hear could get them killed. The man they call teacher looks into their eyes with an intensity that seems to pierce through flesh and bone, straight into their souls. His voice drops to barely above a whisper as he speaks words that will echo through history, words that were never meant for public ears. To you, it has been given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them, it has not been given. For 2,000 years, we've been told a sanitized version of Jesus' teachings. Sunday school stories about loving your neighbor and turning the other cheek. But what if I told you that was just the surface layer? What if the real teachings, the dangerous ones, were deliberately hidden from the masses? Tonight, we're diving into the forbidden history that religious institutions never wanted you to discover. We're uncovering the explosive secrets that Jesus only shared with his inner circle. Truths so revolutionary, they threatened to topple the entire religious establishment of his time. And here's the thing that might shock you the most. These weren't just ancient teachings meant for a select few. These were instructions for awakening something within you that's been dormant for centuries, something that makes you far more powerful than any religious authority ever wanted you to realize. This isn't your typical Bible study. This is a historical rabbit hole that leads to the most suppressed knowledge in human history. And by the end of this series, you'll understand why certain people have worked so hard to keep these teachings buried. But first, we need to understand the world Jesus was operating in, because the political and religious climate of first century Palestine wasn't just the backdrop for his ministry. It was the very reason he had to speak in code. Picture Jerusalem under Roman occupation. The temple, that magnificent structure that dominated the city's skyline, wasn't just a place of worship, it was the center of a massive financial empire. The high priests weren't just spiritual leaders, they were political players who had cut deals with Rome to maintain their power and wealth. The religious establishment had created a system where ordinary people needed intermediaries to access the divine. You couldn't just walk into the Holy of Holies and commune with God directly. You needed priests, sacrifices, temple taxes, and endless rituals. They had built a spiritual monopoly, and business was booming. Into this world, walk everything upside down, to carpenter's son who was about to turn. But here's where the story gets interesting. Jesus wasn't just some peaceful teacher wandering around telling people to be nice to each other. He was a revolutionary who understood that real change happens not through political uprising, but through awakening people to their own divine nature. The Gospel of Mark tells us that Jesus taught the crowds in parables, but when he was alone with his disciples, he explained everything. That word, everything, should make you pause. What exactly was he explaining that was too dangerous for public consumption? The answer lies in understanding the difference between exoteric and esoteric teachings. Every major spiritual tradition has had this two-tiered system. There's the outer teaching for the masses, safe, metaphorical, designed not to ruffle too many feathers. And then there's the inner teaching for those ready to handle the full truth. Jesus mastered this approach out of necessity. One wrong word in public and he'd be dragged before the Sanhedrin or nailed to a cross before his mission was complete. So he developed an ingenious system of coded language that would fly over the heads of the authorities, but land like lightning bolts in the hearts of those ready to receive it. Consider his famous statement, "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed." To the casual listener, this sounds like a pleasant agricultural metaphor about small beginnings leading to great things. But to his inner circle, he revealed that this kingdom wasn't some distant paradise you had to die to reach. It was a state of consciousness, accessible right here, right now. The word Jesus used in Aramaic for kingdom was Malkutha, which doesn't just mean a place ruled by a king. It means sovereignty, dominion, the power to rule. When he told his disciples privately that the kingdom of heaven is within you, he wasn't being poetic. He was revealing that divine consciousness, the very force that creates and sustains reality, was their birthright. This teaching was dynamite. If everyone has direct access to divine power, what do you need priests for? If the kingdom is within you, why do you need a temple? If you can commune with the infinite directly, why do you need religious intermediaries taking their cut? But the inner teachings went even deeper than this. In the privacy of those late-night gatherings, Jesus began to reveal truths about the nature of reality itself that would have sounded like pure blasphemy to the religious establishment. He taught that consciousness and matter weren't separate things, that what we call the physical world was actually consciousness in a denser form. He showed his disciples that their bodies weren't prisons trapping divine souls, but sacred vessels through which infinite awareness could experience itself in form. This wasn't abstract philosophy. Jesus demonstrated these principles through what we call miracles: walking on water, multiplying loaves and fishes, healing the sick, even raising the dead. But here's what the church doesn't want you to know. He never claimed these abilities were unique to him. In John 14:12, he makes one of the most radical statements in all of Scripture. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever believes in me will also do the works that I do, and greater works than these will he do. Greater works, not the same works, not lesser works, greater works. Why would Jesus tell his followers they would surpass his own demonstrations of divine power? Because he understood something that's been systematically suppressed for 2 millennia. He wasn't the only Son of God. He was showing everyone else how to remember that they were too. This brings us to perhaps the most dangerous teaching of all, the one that would have gotten Jesus executed immediately if he'd spoken it publicly. It's hidden in plain sight in the Gospel of John, but you have to know how to read between the lines. When Jesus declared, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," the religious authorities heard him claiming exclusive divinity. But to his inner circle, he revealed that these weren't personal pronouns. He was speaking as pure consciousness itself, the I am presence that exists at the core of every human being. He wasn't saying Jesus of Nazareth is the only way to God. He was revealing that the divine consciousness expressing through him was the same divine consciousness that could express through anyone who awakened to their true nature. This is why his disciples were able to perform similar miracles after his death. They weren't channeling some external deity. They were accessing the same infinite creative power that Jesus had demonstrated was their birthright all along. But accessing this power required more than just belief or faith. It required a complete transformation of consciousness, a death and rebirth that Jesus called being born again. This wasn't a metaphor for accepting certain religious doctrines. It was a description of the actual process of awakening from the dream of separation into the recognition of unity. The early Christian communities understood this. They weren't just worshipping Jesus, they were following his instructions for achieving the same state of consciousness he embodied. They called it putting on the mind of Christ, and it was understood to be a practical possibility, not just a pious hope. So what happened? How did these revolutionary teachings get buried under centuries of religious dogma and institutional control? The answer involves one of the greatest cover-ups in human history, a systematic campaign to transform Jesus from a teacher of human potential into a distant deity, to be worshipped but never equaled. We'll explore that betrayal in the next part of our journey into forbidden history. But for now, let me leave you with a question that might keep you awake tonight. If Jesus really did teach that every human being has the potential to access divine consciousness directly, what would that mean for your life right now? What if everything you've been taught about your limitations, your need for external salvation, your dependence on religious authorities. What if all of that was designed to keep you from discovering the infinite power that lies dormant within your own awareness? The rabbit hole goes much deeper than most people imagine, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface. The transformation began in 313 AD with a single signature on a piece of parchment. Emperor Constantine signed the Edict of Milan, officially ending the persecution of Christians throughout the Roman Empire. On the surface, this seemed like divine providence. Finally, followers of Jesus could worship openly without fear of being thrown to the lions. But something far more sinister was actually taking place. The same imperial system that had crucified Jesus was now embracing his movement, and they had very specific reasons for doing so. You see, the early Christian communities were becoming a problem for Roman authority. These weren't just religious groups gathering for Sunday worship. They were radical communities that shared everything in common, rejected the Roman class system, and worst of all, they claimed allegiance to a kingdom that wasn't Caesar's. They called each other brothers and sisters regardless of social status. Slaves sat next to senators. Women held positions of spiritual authority. They refused to participate in emperor worship or acknowledge any earthly ruler as divine. They were, in essence, creating an alternative society based on the dangerous teachings Jesus had shared with his inner circle. Rome had tried crushing them through persecution, but that only made the movement grow stronger. Every martyr became a symbol of resistance. Every underground gathering became a seed of revolution. The empire needed a different strategy. What if, instead of fighting the Christian movement, they co-opted it? What if they could transform Jesus from a revolutionary teacher into a distant deity who endorsed earthly authority rather than challenging it? This is exactly what happened during the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Constantine gathered bishops from across the empire, ostensibly to settle theological disputes about the nature of Christ. But the real agenda was much more political. The debates weren't really about whether Jesus was divine. The early Christians had always understood his divine nature. The question was whether that divinity was something unique to him alone, or something he came to awaken in others. The faction that won, backed by imperial power, established a doctrine that would effectively neuter Jesus' most dangerous teachings. They declared that Jesus was the only begotten Son of God, a unique divine being whose nature could never be replicated by ordinary humans. This wasn't just theological hair-splitting. It was a calculated move to transform Christianity from a path of awakening into a religion of dependence. If Jesus alone possessed divine nature, then everyone else needed intermediaries, priests, bishops, and ultimately the church itself to access the divine. The Gnostic Christians, who had preserved the inner teachings Jesus shared with his disciples, were systematically hunted down and eliminated. Their gospels were burned. Their communities were scattered. Their understanding of human potential was branded as heresy. What survived was a carefully sanitized version of Jesus' message that served imperial interests perfectly. Submit to earthly authority because it's divinely ordained. Don't seek direct connection with the divine. Trust the church to mediate for you. Your salvation comes from believing the right doctrines, not from awakening to your own divine nature. The most radical spiritual teacher in human history had been successfully domesticated. But here's what the empire didn't count on. Truth has a way of surviving, even when it's driven underground. The real teachings Jesus shared with his inner circle didn't disappear completely. They went into hiding, preserved by secret societies, mystery schools, and mystical traditions that operated in the shadows for centuries. The Knights Templar discovered something during their excavations beneath Solomon's Temple in Jerusalem. The Cathars in southern France were massacred by the Catholic Church for preserving teachings that threatened orthodox doctrine. The Renaissance was sparked partly by the rediscovery of ancient texts that revealed a very different picture of early Christianity. Even today, archaeological discoveries continue to challenge the official narrative. The Nag Hammadi library, discovered in Egypt in 1945, contained dozens of Gospels and texts that had been hidden for over 1,600 years. These documents reveal a Christianity that looks nothing like what Constantine's empire created. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, "I am not your master. Because you have drunk, you have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring which I have measured out." He's speaking to someone who has achieved the same state of consciousness he embodies. The Gospel of Philip contains this explosive statement: "Those who say they will die first and then rise are in error. If they do not first receive the resurrection while they live, when they die, they will receive nothing." Resurrection isn't something that happens after death. It's a transformation of consciousness available right now. These texts reveal that the earliest Christians understood Jesus not as a unique savior, but as a way shower demonstrating what was possible for all humanity. They saw his crucifixion and resurrection not as a sacrifice for human sin, but as a demonstration of consciousness transcending the illusion of death. But perhaps the most suppressed aspect of Jesus' private teachings involves what he revealed about the nature of reality itself. In those intimate gatherings with his inner circle, he shared knowledge that sounds remarkably similar to what quantum physics is discovering today. He taught that what we perceive as solid matter is actually condensed consciousness, that the observer and the observed are one. That reality responds to the quality of awareness we bring to it. This is why he could walk on water, not because he violated natural laws, but because he understood that those laws are expressions of consciousness, and consciousness operating from its true nature can reshape apparent limitations. This is why he could multiply loaves and fishes, not through supernatural magic, but by recognizing that abundance is the natural state when consciousness isn't constrained by beliefs in scarcity. This is why he could heal the sick with a touch or even a word, because he understood that illness is often consciousness believing in separation from wholeness, and that belief could be transformed instantaneously when met with true recognition. But here's the part that would have gotten him stoned to death if he taught it publicly. He told his disciples that these weren't supernatural abilities unique to him. They were natural expressions of consciousness operating from its unconditioned state. In the Gospel of John, he says something that should stop every Christian in their tracks. "Is it not written in your law, I have said you are gods?" He's quoting Psalm 82, where the divine voice declares to human beings, "You are gods, children of the Most High, all of you." Jesus wasn't claiming to be the only divine being among humans. He was reminding humans that they were divine beings who had forgotten their true nature. This brings us to the most carefully guarded secret of all, the real meaning of the phrase Christ consciousness. The word Christ comes from the Greek Christos, meaning anointed one. But in the mystery traditions of the ancient world, being anointed wasn't just a ceremonial act, it was recognition of a transformed state of consciousness. When Jesus' disciples began to recognize this same consciousness awakening within themselves, they didn't call themselves Christians in the way we understand the term today. They called themselves the awakened ones, or those who had put on the mind of Christ. Paul, despite his later reputation for orthodox doctrine, clearly understood this. In his letter to the Galatians, he writes, "I have been crucified with Christ, yet I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me." This isn't metaphorical language. Paul is describing the actual death of the ego self and the birth of divine consciousness as one's true identity. He's not worshipping Jesus as an external savior. He's recognizing the same consciousness that expressed through Jesus, now expressing through him. But perhaps the most shocking revelation preserved in the inner teachings involves what Jesus said about the end times. The apocalypse, the second coming, the transformation of the world, all of this has been completely misunderstood by institutional Christianity. Jesus wasn't predicting some future cosmic event where he would return as a conquering king. He was describing the awakening of Christ consciousness within humanity itself. The second coming wasn't about his personal return. It was about the mass awakening of human beings to their divine nature. This is why he told his disciples, "Truly, I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God come with power." He wasn't making a failed prediction about his immediate return. He was revealing that the transformation he embodied was available to anyone, at any time, who was ready to undergo the death and rebirth of consciousness he had demonstrated. The kingdom of God isn't a future paradise. It's a present reality that becomes visible when consciousness shifts from identification with the separate self to recognition of its true nature as infinite awareness. This understanding changes everything. It means you're not waiting for salvation from some external source. It means the divine power that religious institutions have claimed to mediate is actually the very essence of what you are. But before you can fully grasp the implications of this recognition, we need to explore what Jesus taught about the process of awakening itself. Because accessing this consciousness isn't just a matter of believing the right ideas. It requires a complete transformation that most people aren't prepared for. The path Jesus outlined for his inner circle was far more radical and demanding than anything you'll hear in modern churches. And that's exactly where our journey takes us next. The transformation Jesus described to his inner circle wasn't gentle, it wasn't comfortable, and it certainly wasn't the feel-good spirituality that fills modern churches on Sunday mornings. In those hushed conversations after the crowds had gone home, Jesus spoke of a process he called being born again, but not in the way televangelists use that phrase today. He was describing something that would terrify most people if they truly understood what it meant. Picture Nicodemus, that Pharisee who came to Jesus under cover of darkness because he couldn't risk being seen with this radical teacher during daylight hours. When Jesus told him, "You must be born again," Nicodemus asked the obvious question, how can someone be born when they are old? Surely they cannot enter a second time into their mother's womb. But Jesus wasn't talking about physical birth. He was describing the death of everything you think you are, followed by the emergence of what you actually are. And that process, he warned his disciples, would feel like dying, because in a very real sense, it is. The ego, that collection of thoughts, memories, and beliefs you've been calling myself your entire life, doesn't give up its throne without a fight. When consciousness begins to recognize its true nature, the false self fights back with everything it has. Fear, doubt, confusion, even physical symptoms that can feel like you're losing your mind. Jesus called this taking up your cross daily, but he wasn't talking about enduring hardship for some future reward. He was describing the daily practice of allowing the separate self to die so that your divine nature could express itself more freely. His disciples experienced this transformation firsthand, and their accounts reveal just how intense this process actually is. Peter, the impulsive fisherman who would later be called the rock upon which the church was built, went through a complete personality, death, and rebirth. The man who denied knowing Jesus 3 times during the crucifixion emerged from that experience as someone who could face his own martyrdom with unshakable peace. Paul's dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus wasn't just a change of religious opinion. He described it as being struck blind, unable to eat or drink for 3 days. Classic symptoms of what mystics call ego death. When he emerged from that experience, he said, "I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me." These weren't metaphors. They were describing an actual neurological and spiritual rewiring that happens when consciousness stops identifying with the conditioned mind and recognizes its unlimited nature. But here's what makes this particularly dangerous knowledge. Once you understand this process, you realize that every major religious institution has been designed to prevent it from happening. Think about it. If people discovered they could access divine consciousness directly, without intermediaries, what would happen to the entire religious establishment? If humans realized they didn't need external salvation because they were never actually separate from the divine to begin with, what would happen to the billion-dollar industries built on spiritual dependency? This is why the institutional church has always been suspicious of mystical experience. It's why they've branded as heretical every group that discovered these inner teachings. It's why they've created elaborate theological systems that keep the divine safely distant and accessible only through official channels. The Catholic Church's doctrine of transubstantiation is a perfect example. They teach that only ordained priests can transform bread and wine into the actual body and blood of Christ. But Jesus told his disciples that this transformation wasn't limited to ritual. It was a description of what happens to human consciousness itself when it recognizes its divine nature. When he said, "This is my body, broken for you, and this is my blood, poured out for you," he was revealing that physical matter and spiritual essence aren't separate things. Consciousness and form are one reality appearing as two. Your body isn't a prison housing a divine soul. It's divine consciousness expressing itself as apparently solid matter. This understanding transforms everything about how you relate to your physical existence. Instead of trying to transcend the body, you begin to recognize it as a sacred vessel through which infinite awareness experiences itself in form. Jesus demonstrated this recognition when he walked on water. Water didn't become solid under his feet. His consciousness stopped believing in the absolute reality of physical limitations. When you truly understand that matter is consciousness in a denser form, the apparent laws of physics become more like guidelines that can be transcended through alignment with deeper principles. But accessing this level of recognition requires what Jesus called single vision. In the Sermon on the Mount, he said, "The lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is single, your whole body will be full of light." This wasn't poetic language. He was giving precise instructions for a specific practice that his inner circle would have understood immediately, even though it's been completely lost in modern Christianity. The single eye refers to what mystics call the third eye. Not some mystical organ, but a state of consciousness where the duality between observer and observed collapses into unified awareness. When attention turns inward and focuses on the space between thoughts, behind emotions, beneath all mental activity, something extraordinary happens. You discover that there's an awareness present that's watching even your act of watching. This witness consciousness isn't personal. It's the same awareness that looks out through every pair of eyes, that animates every human heart. That is the very ground of existence itself. This is what Jesus meant when he said, "I and the Father are one." He wasn't claiming unique divinity. He was describing the recognition that individual consciousness and universal consciousness are the same thing appearing as two. But here's where it gets really dangerous for religious authority. Once you have this recognition, you realize that every human being is having the same fundamental experience. The awareness looking out through your eyes is identical to the awareness looking out through everyone else's eyes. This isn't a belief or philosophy. It's a direct, undeniable experience that changes everything about how you see yourself and others. Suddenly, loving your neighbor as yourself isn't a moral commandment you're trying to follow. It's a description of reality as you actually experience it. The implications of this recognition are staggering. If there's only one consciousness appearing as many, then every act of harm toward another is literally self-harm. Every act of love toward another is literally self-love. The golden rule isn't an ethical teaching. It's a description of how reality actually works. This is why Jesus could say, "Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me." Wow. He wasn't being poetic. He was describing the actual structure of consciousness itself. But perhaps the most suppressed aspect of these inner teachings involves what Jesus revealed about death itself. The crucifixion and resurrection weren't historical events that happened to one special person. They were demonstrations of what's possible for any consciousness that stops identifying with the temporary form it appears to inhabit. When Jesus told his disciples, "I am the resurrection and the life," he wasn't making a claim about his personal powers. He was revealing that the consciousness he embodied, the same consciousness that exists at the core of every human being, is literally deathless. Physical forms come and go like waves on the ocean, but the ocean itself remains unchanged. Bodies are born and die, but the awareness that animates them is eternal, infinite, unchanging. Death is just the end of a particular appearance, not the end of what you fundamentally are. This understanding removes the fear of death that religious institutions have used to control people for millennia. When you recognize yourself as infinite consciousness, temporarily wearing a human form, death becomes no more threatening than taking off a set of clothes at the end of the day. But it also reveals something even more revolutionary. You don't have to wait until physical death to experience this freedom. The resurrection Jesus demonstrated is available right now, in this moment, as soon as consciousness stops identifying with its temporary appearance and recognizes its eternal nature. This is what he meant when he told his disciples they would do greater works than he had done. Not because they would perform more spectacular miracles, but because they would help consciousness awaken to itself on a scale that would transform the entire planet. The mass awakening Jesus prophesied isn't some future event. It's happening right now as more and more humans begin to remember what they really are. Every person who undergoes this recognition becomes a catalyst for others. Every ego that dies and is reborn as conscious awareness makes it easier for the next one. This is the real second coming. Not the return of a historical figure, but the awakening of Christ consciousness within humanity itself. And it's accelerating at a pace that would have been impossible to imagine even 50 years ago. But before we can fully understand what this means for our current moment in history, we need to explore how these teachings survived the centuries of suppression and why they're suddenly surfacing again now. The knowledge didn't die with the early Christian communities. It went underground, preserved by groups who understood that timing was everything, and that these truths would only be safe to share when humanity was ready to receive them without destroying itself in the process. The preservation happened through networks so secretive that even today, scholars can only piece together fragments of their operations. The Knights Templar, those warrior monks who supposedly guarded Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, were actually conducting archaeological excavations beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. What they discovered there changed everything. Historical records show that 9 knights arrived in Jerusalem in 1119, claiming they wanted to protect pilgrims. But here's what doesn't add up. They didn't recruit new members for 9 years. 9 men supposedly protecting thousands of pilgrims across hundreds of miles of dangerous territory. It's absurd. What they were really doing was digging. Beneath Solomon's temple, they found chambers that had been sealed for centuries. Inside those chambers were scrolls, texts, and artifacts that revealed the true nature of Jesus' private teachings. The knowledge they uncovered made them the most powerful organization in medieval Europe within decades. The Templars developed a banking system that spanned continents. They built cathedrals whose architectural principles encoded mystical knowledge. They created a network of initiates who preserved these inner teachings through symbols, rituals, and carefully guarded oral traditions. But they made one fatal mistake. They became too powerful, too threatening to established authority. On Friday the 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France and Pope Clement V orchestrated their destruction. The official charges were heresy, idolatry, and corruption. The real reason was that they possessed knowledge that could topple both church and crown. The few Templars who escaped carried their secrets into other organizations. The Cathars in southern France, the Rosicrucians in Germany, the mystery schools of Renaissance Italy. All of them preserved pieces of what Jesus had taught his inner circle. The Cathars called themselves the Perfect Ones, not out of arrogance, but because they had achieved what they termed the consolamentum, a spiritual awakening that freed them from the cycle of death and rebirth. They taught that matter and spirit weren't separate, that the divine spark existed within every human being, and that direct communion with the infinite required no priestly intermediary. Sound familiar? These were exactly the teachings Jesus had shared in those hidden chambers beneath Jerusalem. The Catholic Church's response was swift and brutal. Pope Innocent III declared a crusade against the Cathars in 1209, the only crusade ever launched against fellow Christians on European soil. The massacre at Béziers saw 20,000 men, women and children slaughtered. When a soldier asked how to distinguish between Catholics and heretics, the papal legate reportedly replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." But even mass murder couldn't completely erase the knowledge. It scattered like seeds in the wind, taking root wherever consciousness was ready to receive it. The Renaissance explosion of art, science, and philosophy wasn't just a cultural awakening. It was the direct result of these suppressed teachings resurfacing. Leonardo da Vinci encoded mystical principles in his paintings. Michelangelo hid Gnostic symbolism in the Sistine Chapel. Dante's Divine Comedy was actually a map of consciousness exploring its own depths. These artists understood something that had been systematically removed from official Christianity. The human being is not a fallen creature in need of salvation, but a divine being in the process of remembering its true nature. The printing press, invented around 1440, changed everything. For the first time in history, knowledge could be preserved and distributed without relying on monastic scribes who answered to church authority. Ancient texts that had been locked away in monastery libraries suddenly became available to anyone who could read. The Protestant Reformation wasn't just about challenging Catholic authority. It was about returning to source texts that revealed a very different picture of early Christianity. When Martin Luther translated the Bible into German, he wasn't just making scripture accessible to common people. He was giving them direct access to teachings that had been filtered through centuries of institutional interpretation. But even the Protestant reformers didn't go far enough. They still maintained the fundamental premise that Jesus was uniquely divine, that humans needed external salvation, that direct spiritual experience was dangerous without proper theological guidance. The real preservation happened in the mystical traditions that operated parallel to organized religion. The Sufis in Islam, the Kabbalists in Judaism, the Advaita masters in Hinduism, all of them maintained teachings that were remarkably similar to what Jesus had shared with his inner circle. This wasn't coincidence. Truth has a way of expressing itself through whatever cultural forms are available. The same consciousness that spoke through Jesus found expression through Rumi, through Isaac Luria, through Shankara. Different languages, different symbols, same essential recognition. In 17th century England, groups like the Quakers began experiencing what they called the inner light, direct communion with divine consciousness that required no external mediation. George Fox, their founder, declared that every person had that of God within them. The established church branded them as heretics and threw them in prison. The Moravians in Germany developed communities based on what they called heart religion, direct spiritual experience rather than intellectual doctrine. John Wesley, who would later found Methodism, experienced his famous heart strangely warmed during a Moravian meeting. Even within Protestantism, the mystical tradition kept surfacing, but perhaps the most significant development happened in the 18th and 19th centuries, when Western scholars began translating ancient texts from India, Tibet, and other Eastern traditions. Suddenly, European intellectuals discovered philosophical systems that had preserved for millennia the same teachings Jesus had shared privately with his disciples. The Upanishads spoke of the individual self and universal self as identical. Buddhist texts described the dissolution of ego consciousness and the recognition of infinite awareness. Taoist masters wrote about the unity underlying apparent duality. These weren't foreign concepts being imported from alien cultures. They were the same truths that had been systematically suppressed in the West for over 1,000 years. The East had simply maintained what the West had lost. This convergence sparked a spiritual renaissance that continues to this day. Transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau began articulating non-dualistic insights that sounded remarkably like the private teachings Jesus had given his inner circle. Emerson wrote, "We lie in the lap of immense intelligence, which makes us receivers of its truth and organs of its activity." Thoreau declared, "Heaven is under our feet as well as over our heads." These weren't just poetic insights. They were direct recognitions of the same consciousness that had expressed through Jesus 2,000 years earlier. But the real explosion happened in the 20th century, when archaeological discoveries began confirming what the mystical traditions had preserved all along. The Nag Hammadi library, discovered in Egypt in 1945, contained over 50 texts that had been buried around 400 CE to protect them from Orthodox Christian persecution. These Gospels revealed a Christianity that looked nothing like what Constantine's empire had created. The Gospel of Thomas presented Jesus as a wisdom teacher, pointing people toward their own inner divinity. The Gospel of Philip described resurrection as a transformation available in this lifetime. The Gospel of Mary showed women holding positions of spiritual authority that would be unthinkable in patriarchal Christianity. Each discovery chipped away at the official narrative. The Dead Sea Scrolls revealed that Jesus' teachings emerged from a rich tradition of Jewish mysticism. The Gnostic texts showed that early Christians understood salvation as awakening, not as rescue by an external deity. Modern neuroscience began providing scientific validation for experiences that mystics had been describing for millennia. Studies of meditation showed measurable changes in brain structure. Research into psychedelics revealed states of consciousness that matched historical accounts of mystical awakening. Quantum physics discovered that consciousness and matter interact in ways that sound remarkably like what Jesus had taught about the power of focused awareness. The internet completed the process that the printing press had begun. Ancient texts became available to anyone with a computer. Mystical teachings that had been preserved in oral traditions for centuries were suddenly accessible to millions of people simultaneously. Social media allowed seekers to connect across geographical boundaries. Online communities formed around shared recognition of truths that had been hidden for 2 millennia. The democratization of knowledge made it impossible for any institution to maintain monopolistic control over spiritual information. This brings us to our current moment, a time when the private teachings Jesus shared with his inner circle are more accessible than they've been since the 1st century. But accessibility doesn't mean readiness. Having information available isn't the same as being prepared to integrate it. The consciousness shift that Jesus initiated 2,000 years ago is accelerating exponentially. More humans are experiencing direct spiritual awakening in a single generation than in the previous 10 centuries combined. But this acceleration is also creating unprecedented challenges. When ego consciousness begins dissolving, the experience can be overwhelming without proper context and support. When people discover their divine nature, but lack the wisdom traditions to guide that recognition, chaos often results. When ancient teachings meet modern psychology without skilled integration, spiritual bypassing and premature claims of enlightenment become common. This is why the timing matters so much. The teachings were hidden not just to protect them from persecution, but to preserve them until humanity had developed the psychological sophistication and spiritual maturity to handle them responsibly. We're living in that moment right now. The question isn't whether these teachings will continue surfacing. That process is already unstoppable. The question is whether we can integrate them with enough wisdom to avoid the pitfalls that have derailed spiritual movements throughout history. But before we can explore what that integration looks like, we need to understand exactly what Jesus meant when he told his disciples they would do greater works than he had done. Because the implications of that promise are more radical than anything we've discussed so far. The promise echoes through history like thunder rolling across mountains. Greater works than these shall you do. But what did Jesus actually mean when he spoke those words to his inner circle? What could possibly be greater than walking on water, raising the dead, or feeding 5,000 people with a handful of bread and fish? The answer lies in understanding something that would have been impossible for his first-century disciples to comprehend. The concept of collective awakening on a planetary scale. When Jesus performed miracles, he was demonstrating the power of individual consciousness aligned with its divine source. One person, fully awakened, could bend the apparent laws of reality through recognition of deeper principles. But what he envisioned for his followers was something far more ambitious, a network of awakened consciousness that could transform the entire human experience. Think about it this way. Jesus touched perhaps a few thousand lives directly during his 3-year ministry. His inner circle numbered 12. Even if we include the broader group of followers, we're talking about maybe a few hundred people who experienced his presence firsthand. But those few hundred became the seed for a movement that would eventually reach billions of people across 2 millennia. The greater works weren't about individual disciples surpassing their teachers' abilities. They were about the exponential spread of awakened consciousness through human networks. Each person who undergoes the death and rebirth Jesus described becomes a catalyst for others, not through preaching or proselytizing, but through the simple fact that awakened consciousness is contagious. When you're in the presence of someone who has recognized their true nature, something in you responds, a resonance occurs, a remembering begins. This is why Jesus told his disciples, "You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden." He wasn't talking about moral example or religious behavior. He was describing the actual energetic impact of consciousness that has recognized itself as infinite awareness, temporarily wearing human form. But here's where the teaching gets truly revolutionary. Jesus understood that this awakening process would accelerate exponentially as it spread. Each generation would have access to more awakened beings than the previous one. The collective field of consciousness would become increasingly coherent, making it easier for others to recognize their true nature. We're witnessing this acceleration right now. The number of people experiencing direct spiritual awakening in our lifetime exceeds the total number who experienced it in the previous 1,000 years. Social media allows seekers to connect instantly across continents. Ancient wisdom traditions that took decades to encounter are now accessible with a few keystrokes. But more significantly, the quality of consciousness itself appears to be shifting. Many spiritual teachers report that their students are experiencing in months what used to take years or decades to achieve. The traditional stages of spiritual development are compressing. The barriers between ordinary consciousness and awakened awareness are becoming more permeable. This isn't just spiritual speculation, it's measurable. Meditation research shows that experienced practitioners can now achieve brain states in minutes that previously required years of training. Studies of psychedelic therapy reveal that single sessions can produce lasting transformations that traditional psychotherapy might take decades to accomplish. Something is changing at the fundamental level of human consciousness itself. The operating system is upgrading, and the upgrade is accelerating. But Jesus warned his inner circle that this acceleration would come with challenges. In the Gospel of Matthew, he spoke of a time when many will come in my name, claiming to represent his teachings, but actually leading people astray. He wasn't just predicting false prophets. He was describing the inevitable distortions that occur when powerful spiritual technologies spread faster than wisdom can integrate them. We see this happening everywhere today. Ancient practices like meditation and yoga have been commercialized and stripped of their deeper purpose. Psychedelic experiences that were once reserved for carefully prepared initiates are now available to anyone with internet access and basic chemistry knowledge. Awakening experiences that traditionally required years of preparation are happening spontaneously to people who have no framework for understanding them. The result is a spiritual landscape filled with both unprecedented opportunity and unprecedented confusion. More people than ever are touching their divine nature, but fewer than ever have the context and support systems to integrate those experiences wisely. This brings us to what might be the most important aspect of Jesus' private teachings, the instructions he gave for navigating the integration process safely and sustainably. In those late-night gatherings, after the crowds had dispersed and only the inner circle remained, Jesus didn't just reveal the nature of divine consciousness. He provided detailed guidance for how to embody that recognition without losing your mind or your humanity in the process. The path he outlined was radically different from both the ascetic traditions that sought to transcend the world and the worldly traditions that ignored the spiritual dimension entirely. Jesus taught what we might call incarnational awakening, the full embodiment of divine consciousness within ordinary human existence. This meant learning to live simultaneously as both human and divine, form and formlessness, individual and universal. It required developing what he called eyes to see and ears to hear, the ability to perceive the sacred within the mundane, the eternal within the temporal, the infinite within the finite. Most importantly, it demanded what Jesus termed becoming like little children, not in terms of naivety or dependence, but in terms of wonder, spontaneity, and openness to continuous learning and growth. The awakened state wasn't a final destination, but an ongoing exploration of consciousness, discovering itself through ever deeper expressions of love, creativity, and service. This understanding transforms everything about how we approach spiritual development. Instead of seeking some peak experience that will solve all our problems, we begin to recognize awakening as a process of learning to dance more skillfully with the mystery of existence itself. The greater works Jesus promised aren't about performing spectacular miracles to impress others. They're about the patient, persistent work of helping consciousness awaken to itself through whatever circumstances arise. They're about becoming so transparent to divine love that your very presence becomes a blessing to everyone you encounter. This is happening right now, all around us, in ways that would have seemed impossible even 50 years ago. Ordinary people are discovering extraordinary states of consciousness. Business leaders are incorporating contemplative practices into corporate culture. Scientists are studying the effects of love and compassion on physical health. Artists are channeling insights that bridge ancient wisdom and contemporary understanding. The revolution Jesus initiated 2,000 years ago is finally reaching critical mass. The private teachings he shared with 12 frightened disciples in hidden chambers are now available to anyone ready to receive them. The kingdom of heaven he described as being within you is being recognized by millions of people who never set foot in a church. But perhaps most remarkably, the process is becoming self-sustaining. Each person who recognizes their divine nature becomes a node in a growing network of awakened consciousness. The field effect becomes stronger with each new recognition. The tipping point approaches where awakening becomes not just possible, but inevitable for anyone open to the truth of what they are. This is the ultimate fulfillment of Jesus' promise. Not that his followers would perform greater miracles, but that they would participate in the greatest miracle of all, the collective awakening of human consciousness to its own divine nature. We stand at the threshold of that fulfillment right now. The question isn't whether this transformation will occur, it's already occurring. The question is whether you're ready to step fully into your role as one of the awakened ones, one of the light bearers, one of those who carry forward the flame that Jesus lit 2,000 years ago in a hidden chamber beneath the streets of Jerusalem. The inner circle is gathering again. The private teachings are being whispered once more. But this time, they're not confined to a handful of disciples meeting in secret. They're spreading through networks of consciousness that span the globe, touching hearts and minds in ways that would have been unimaginable in any previous era. The greatest work is beginning, and you, whether you realize it or not, are part of it. The recognition is spreading faster than any institution can contain it. In living rooms across suburbia, corporate boardrooms in Manhattan, meditation halls in California, and coffee shops in small-town America, people are discovering what Jesus whispered to his 12 disciples in those torch-lit chambers 2 millennia ago. But here's what's truly extraordinary about this moment in history. The awakening isn't happening in isolation anymore. It's becoming networked, connected. When consciousness recognizes itself in one person, it creates ripples that make recognition easier for others. The field effect is amplifying. Social media platforms designed for entertainment are accidentally becoming vehicles for spiritual transmission. A simple post about someone's awakening experience can trigger recognition in thousands of people simultaneously. Online meditation groups are creating coherent fields of consciousness that transcend geographical boundaries. Digital communities are forming around recognitions that would have taken lifetimes to encounter just decades ago. The technology that was supposed to separate us is actually facilitating the most intimate spiritual communion in human history. Seekers who would have spent decades searching for teachers are finding guidance instantly. Ancient practices that were once guarded secrets of mystery schools are now available in smartphone apps. The democratization of awakening is happening at light speed. But Jesus warned his inner circle about something that's becoming critically relevant right now. He spoke of a time when the wheat and the tares would grow together until the harvest, when genuine awakening and spiritual delusion would be so intermingled that only the deepest discernment could distinguish between them. We're living in that time. For every authentic recognition of divine consciousness, there are dozens of spiritual bypasses, premature claims of enlightenment, and ego-driven presentations of awakening. The marketplace of consciousness is flooded with products that promise instant transformation without the surrender that genuine awakening requires. The lamp still flickers in that stone chamber beneath Jerusalem. 2,000 years later, the same consciousness that spoke through Jesus continues to awaken in hearts around the world. The forbidden teachings are no longer forbidden. They're becoming the foundation of humanity's next evolutionary leap. You now carry what 12 frightened disciples once guarded with their lives. The kingdom within isn't waiting for your permission to emerge. It's already here, already awake, already transforming everything it touches. The greatest work isn't coming. It's happening right now through you.